The entire forum will take an hour and a half at most, with Prof. Kapur not just sharing about flipped learning, but also a bit about productive failure, as that's the backbone for our flipped 4F model. This is then followed by a dialogue session where your questions would be addressed collectively and thematically. During the forum, please feel free to send in your questions, either the Zoom Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen, or even better, just unmute to ask. Remember to post chat in your chat box, as it's going to be with lots of messages. And finally, this forum is not recorded, so remember to take your notes. Now, without much further ado, let me invite on stage Prof. Manu Kapur. Professor Manu Kapur is the Professor for Learning Sciences and Higher Education at ETH Zürich. He's also the Director for the Future Learning Initiative as well. As the head, Prof. Kapur brings together over 20 other professors and 10 departments, distilling their findings into practical directions for training and learning. For those who are not aware, Prof. Kapur has been in an incumbent position before. Prior to this, he was the Professor of Psychological Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. He also worked at our NIE of Singapore as the head of Curriculum Teaching Learning Department, as well as the head of Learning Sciences. Now, in today's session, drawing on his engineering mindset for design and his unconventional thinking on learning, Prof. Kapur will be delving into flipped learning from a lens of productive failure. Over to you, Prof. Oh, I think you're muted. Prof, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I knew I was muted. I was trying to unmute it, but it won't allow me to unmute. But it's all right now that you can hear me. Okay, so let me just share my screen perhaps at this time. There. Is this the right screen, or do you see the other? Hang on.
Okay, we are seeing your notes. Yeah.
There you go. This is good. All right, so let's get started. Thank you, Nilanjana. Thank you for that introduction and the invitation to be a part of this webinar. As you already know, my name is Manu. Just call me Manu. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about active learning, productive failure, and then finally flipped learning. Right. What I do at ETH Zurich is I direct the Future Learning Initiative, just to give you some context about the work that I do. So half of my work is basically fundamental research into human cognition. This goes all the way from physiological basis to neural networks, to cognitive mechanisms, embodiment, social and cultural mechanisms. At any point in time, I have 15 to 20 PhD and postdoctoral projects looking at learning as a complex phenomena across these different layers. So that's the fundamental work, but it doesn't stop there. A big part, half of my work is also applied, and that is the idea that we want to build learning interventions, either actual interventions in the classrooms or edtech applications for higher education and beyond. Right, so that's the nature of the work that I do. So the way I've structured today's webinar, the talk at least, is in three parts. First, we're going to talk about what are the major problems of learning, and then we'll take some questions about that. Then I'm going to introduce active learning and productive failure, and we'll take questions there as well after that. And then finally, we'll come to the last third would be on flipped learning, which will bring it all together in the context of the meta-analyses that have been sent out to you. All right. So if you look at the current model of instruction, and this has been the dominant model of instruction in the industrial era. It's called direct instruction. The underlying logic is simple, that if you do not know if you do not know something new, the best way to teach is to clearly explain exactly what to do and how to do it. And then you apply. So it's really instruction, very good instruction, followed by problem solving where you can apply. So that's the basic model. Now, this has been researched for a long time. And even going back in the 80s, we had already started receiving reports about how the model is not entirely very optimal for learning. So this is Alan Schoenfeld's work back in 1988, where they went into classrooms of very good math lecturers, right? And they saw, and by all accounts, on all metrics, they could judge that, oh, these lecturers are very good teachers of mathematics. When they asked students as to whether they liked the lecture or not, whether they understood from the lecture or not, they received very positive reports that yes, they did. Like students also reported. So on all counts, these are very well taught mathematics courses. The problem was when students were given problem-solving assessments that really tested their conceptual understanding, that probed whether they knew what they were talking about or what they had learned and whether they could apply it to novel situations, they found that the understanding was really shallow. And hence this catchy title, When Good Teaching Leads to Bad Results. It's really a disaster of well-taught mathematics courses. And since then, it's been observed in a number of domains, even though we continue with this model, in a number of domains, it's been observed that direct instruction does not optimize learning, or at least deep learning. Worse, it can give you an illusion that you're actually learning something when in fact it remains very shallow. Right. So just to define the problem that I've kind of taken on in my research for the last 20 years, and this problem is an important problem to define because if you don't define the problem well, then you can't find the solution properly. So the problem that I'm talking about is not that we learn poorly from bad lectures. Of course, that is obvious. But the problem is that we seem to learn poorly from very good ones too. And that's paradoxical because that goes just against any intuitions we might have. But research systematically suggests that if you're trying to learn something new, and if I design a very good lecture for you, chances are you might think that you've learned something when in fact your learning is very shallow. So that's the real problem. We learn poorly from good ones. And that's the problem we need to tackle, especially when we're talking about initial learning. And everything that I'm talking about today is actually all about initial learning. It's not about mastery, fluency, and so on and so forth. No, it's really when you first come to understand something new, what are the cognitive processes underlying that? And how do we design for that initial learning? How do we optimize that initial learning so that the trajectory towards mastery and expertise is optimized as well in a feed-forward manner? Okay, so that's the problem. Now we're going to look at 4 causes, at least 4 causes. There are many more causes, but at least 4 causes from a learning sciences perspective. So the first is the failure to see. We just fail to notice things that are critical, especially in an initial learning situation. So here I like to do a thought experiment. If you've been in my talks before, I apologize. You will already know what I'm going to say. But if you haven't, here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're watching a movie. Right? It's a very entertaining, very engaging movie. Imagine the person sitting next to you is an acclaimed director, somebody who's an expert at making movies. You watch the movie, you're happy, you come out, and I ask you a question. Did you see the same movie as the director? And you say, yeah, of course, Manu, I saw the same movie. But if I asked you, did you see what the director saw? Chances are you would say no. Because given the same stimulus, it's right in front of you, the director would see things that you just won't be able to see it, even if it's right in front of you. And decades of research in cognitive sciences comparing experts with novices shows that regardless of the domain, experts see very different things. In the same perceptual stimulus, experts see very different things from novices. Experts tend to see deep critical features, deep structure, and novices tend to rely on superficial features. Because it turns out seeing or noticing is not a perceptual exercise, because if it were a perceptual exercise, then given the same perceptual stimuli, both experts and novices would see the same thing. It turns out seeing is a cognitive exercise. You see with what you know. And I think that's the fundamental thing that we need to grapple with. So if you're in an initial learning situation where a novice is trying to learn something new and the teacher is trying to teach the novice something new, and the teacher goes straight into a very engaging, well-structured, clear lecture, the problem is that the teacher is assuming that the novice will see what he or she is seeing in their own beautiful lecture. And it turns out that is simply not true. Just because you as an expert can see it does not mean the novice who's trying to learn that thing new, which is entirely new for him or her, is seeing the same thing. So one major implication of this is that the first job of teaching is actually not to teach. The first job is really to prepare the novice to see. Teaching is important, your expert knowledge is important, but you need to first prepare the novice to see. How does one do that? There are many ways. We shall look at that later. But this is one of the major causes why direct instruction, no matter how well designed, how engaging it is, how clear it is, if you keep assuming that the novice is seeing what you're seeing, that's a problem. And you would always be suboptimal in terms of learning outcomes. If I could just stop here and you can, take, like if this lecture were to stop here, you can take it back. This one reason alone, this one slide alone should give you a lot to think about how you want to go back and redesign a learning. But we shall continue. We don't just want people to see and deeply understand new knowledge, but we also want to develop it in ways that they can be creative with it, flexible with it, adaptive with it. And we want this flexibility and adaptiveness so that they can, attack novel problems, transfer to novel situations in new contexts that they haven't encountered before. Why do we then fail to develop creativity? Why does direct instruction fail to develop creativity? So again, another thought experiment. Imagine you're all kids, children who love to play with toys, just like these kids playing with Lego toys. Suppose I would divide the 219 of you into two groups, 220 now, into two groups, and say group 1 and group 2. You can choose which group you want to be in. Just choose 1 or 2, all right, in your minds. So to group 1, I come and say, oh, hey kids, here's a new toy. So I'm showing you a new toy. You've never seen it, you've never played with it. Do you want to play with it? And suppose you say, yeah, I want to play with it. I said, okay, here you go, play with it, play as you like, okay? And you play. Then to group 2, I say, hey kids, here's a new toy. Do you want to play with it? And you say, yeah, I want to play with it. I said, it's a new toy, so let me just show you how it works. I show you how it works. I'll show you, you can do all sorts of things with this new toy. And then I say, now that you've learned how it works, now you play with this toy and play as you like, play freely. So both groups can play freely, except the second group was shown first how the toy works, and then they were asked to play freely, just like the group 1, the first group. Now, if I observed these two groups of students or children and tried to somehow measure how inventive, how creative they were in playing with the toy, which group do you think would be more inventive, more creative with the toy? The group 1, which was just given the toy and asked to play with it freely, or group 2, which was actually given the correct knowledge, that's how the toy works, and also the freedom to then play with it. So chances are, if we were in a nice, if this was in person, then, we could have a nice poll. We could have done a poll here too, but chances are you're thinking group 1 is probably the more inventive, more creative group when it comes to toys. Now, it turns out experiments in child psychology, child development psychology, and there's a lot of work on children playing and children learning that shows precisely that when given an opportunity to play with a new toy and figure out how it works and be inventive and creative with it, group 1 is more inventive, more creative with the toy, whereas group 2 is not as much. In fact, in some studies, it's actually been quantified. It turns out the group 1 who was just given the toy, new toy, and asked to play with it to figure it out, they are almost 3 times as inventive or creative as group 2. Now, what this tells us is that you can start to think of knowledge, concepts, ideas, in formal domains, math, science, languages, and so on and so forth, not just as tangible toys, but as conceptual toys. And part of creativity, part of flexibility, adaptiveness comes from how you learn to play with these toys, how you learn to tinker, and if you've had these opportunities where you have played, tinkered with these toys. So, and that's how you develop creativity. How do we design regular, normal, traditional direct instruction? It's always group 2. We first show you the toy, we show you exactly how to play with the toy, and then we tell you. And then later on, when you don't show flexibility or adaptiveness in using that toy, we lament, oh, how is it that you know so much? I've taught you you've even passed exams on it, but you're not able to be flexible and adaptive with it. It turns out the problem is not with our learners, the problem is in the assumptions that we are making as designers of learning. Because the cognitive architecture doesn't quite work that way. Knowledge in a domain is a double-edged sword. Of course, you need a lot of knowledge to become an expert, but knowledge also boxes you in. It frames your worldview, and so it facilitates action in a particular way, but it also constrains you to go beyond. So the challenge for learning or designing learning is, how do we get the best of both worlds? How do we get people to be flexible and creative so that they're not entirely boxed in, while also developing large amounts of expertise and know-how and knowledge? How do we do that? What we do know is direct instruction doesn't do that. How do we do that? We'll get to it. Right. So that's the second major cause, is the path, the learning path is problematic in terms of how we design these experiences. All right, third problem. Third problem is one of transfer. One reason why we don't transfer, I've already alluded to, is that the knowledge is not encoded in flexible and adaptive ways. Another reason is how we think about knowledge in disciplinary activity. So here you see a carpenter working with an apprentice, right? Suppose the carpenter told the apprentice and said, hey, before you come to the shed, I need you to go and learn a lot of mathematics, because there's a lot of mathematics involved here, number systems, geometry, measurement, and so on and so forth. Oh, and by the way, you also have to learn a lot of physics, because forces, equilibria, and so on are also very important. So make sure you learn physics and chemistry, because you're going to be working with materials and they interact and blah, blah, blah. So make sure you've aced all these subjects. And once you've done that, I will let you in. And then we'll learn carpentry. Except that's not how this is designed. And the idea here is that the apprentice will learn everything there is about carpentry in the activity of carpentry. Because fundamentally the idea is that knowledge, everything that we know, gets situated in what we're doing as we are learning that thing, right? So you can't decouple knowledge from the context or the situation in which it was learned. It's deeply coupled. So if the doings, and by doing I mean not just physical doing, by doing I mean even thinking about something is a doing, listening to something is a doing, solving a problem is a doing, taking notes is a doing, collaborating is a doing, building or designing something is a doing, and so on and so forth. So we are doing something at all times, right? So if you learn mathematics or science or languages tied to particular ways of doing, so for example, by listening and taking notes, but if you have to apply where you have to solve novel problems, that is a problem-solving mode, then the doings are very different. And because knowledge gets situated in doings, it doesn't transfer very well. So if you're training mathematicians, scientists, engineers, doctors, lawyers, the more we design learning environments where the doings of the discipline are aligned with the doings of the schooling or the training, the greater the transfer capabilities. Direct instruction does not do that. It assumes that it does not matter how you get to that knowledge. Once you have it, you should be able to transfer it to a new context. Evidence just simply does not support that. Our human cognitive architecture doesn't work that way. It is not like a file on the computer, how I wish it were, but it is not, right? And then we need to understand what expertise is as well, because that's the fundamental. If you don't understand what expertise is and how it's characterized, what's its flavor, then we're not able to design for it well. We generally tend to think of expertise or experts as people who know a lot of stuff. They have a lot of knowledge, they have a lot of skills, and so in that particular domain. And that is what, and the way we know that is because we can actually see it. These experts talk about it, they can write about it, they can explain things to you. So everything that is explicit in a domain, the rules, the constructs, the grammar, the theorems, the proofs, the structure, these are all explicit. So this is the stuff that can be codified, it can be talked about, it can be represented externally from what somebody knows. That is called explicit knowledge, right? And experts tend to have a lot of this, obviously. Then there's also tacit knowledge, things that even experts do not know that they have, but it is tied to a situation. So in a certain situation, an expert might behave or make a particular decision or do something, and if you ask them, oh, how did you think of doing this? Or why did you do that? And they said, well, it just seemed right in the moment. I mean, that's tacit. It's something that the expert themselves cannot explain it, or explain it with much difficulty. Now, deep expertise is really about the coupling between the explicit and the tacit. And you don't couple in a way that, oh, first you go for explicit and later on you build tacit and somehow this would couple. That does not work. You've got to teach the explicit. The explicit knowledge has to grow in coupling with the tacit knowledge, so that if learning experiences are designed with this coupling in mind from the get-go, then you develop adaptive expertise. But if you decouple them, as we do in direct instruction, we say, let's do the explicit knowledge and let's leave the tacit knowledge to capstones and projects or work experience and everything else, then you're not building deep expertise. And that's what the evidence suggests. So these are the four main problems that I've talked about, the main causes of why we learn poorly from good direct instruction. The problem of seeing, the problem of flexible encoding and creativity, the problem of transfer, and the problem of developing deep expertise. Right. So at this point, I'm going to go into that. We're going to take a short reflection break, take about 2 to 3 minutes, think about the problem and how I've characterized it, think about the four causes, and write down 2 or 3 ideas that you will take back to your practice. So tomorrow, if you meet your colleagues and say, well, I attended Manu's talk, and just based on the first part, here are a couple of things that really stuck with me. So what would those things be? Take a couple of minutes to write that down. Is there a way to share it somehow as well, Nilanjana?
Yeah, they can write the ideas in the chat if that's okay.
Yep, that's fine. So please, everybody, your 2 to 3 ideas in the chat, and I'd love to hear. I'd love to read, rather.
Previous slide, Prof. Manu. If you could just go to the previous slide.
Oh, this one. Is this a slide you wanted to go back to?
Yes.
All right. All right. I see a lot of points. Try to refrain from asking questions about it, but just focus on the key takeaways for you from this first part. We will get to the questions at the end of it. All right, I think we can keep moving. So these are very nice ideas for you to think about and take away. We shall continue. And if you have any questions, I will, of course, take them at the end of it. And it's very interesting for me, especially because I've engaged in direct instruction right now to tell you how direct instruction is so poor, to see what you are seeing. And it kind of proves the point in some way as well. But that's an interesting exercise in and of itself. All right, let's continue, shall we? To part 2. Thank you for putting your reflections on the chat, if this works now. Okay, so the question then becomes now, is active learning a solution? But first, before we think about active learning, let's try to think about what is active learning. So I'm going to give you a scenario or a case where you have to study these 4 situations, learning situations, and rank them from high to low, the depth and retention of learning anticipated from each of these activities. Right, so you can say A greater than B, greater than C, greater than D. That means A is the highest, B is the next, C is the next, and the D is the last, or some other order, starting from high to low. And once you've done that, you can post that in the chat as well. Take a couple of minutes to read and do that. All right, so I think everybody's posting it. So it turns out like you guys have pretty good intuitions about it, obviously. So most people are giving A and B one of the top 2 positions. Most say A is greater than B, and most are also giving D as the D and C as the next 2 options. So D being greater than C, right? So it turns out from research, A and B are definitely above D and C. It's hard to distinguish between D and C because research on highlighting is not very promising to begin with. But yes, technically, if you just do highlighting, it should. If you do highlighting on top of actually reading something, it's theoretically supposed to be helpful than just listening to something, because there's more cognitive effort in that. So D should be greater than C, but research doesn't support it always. But yes, between A and B, the main difference is that in A, people are working together in pairs, and B, the student is individually. And again, it can go both ways, for A and B, because working in pairs is good to the extent that people can work productively. So collaboration has a cost attached to it, that you need to learn how to collaborate so that you can collaborate to learn. So there's a caveat there. But if you put ad hoc collaboration together, sometimes that interferes with the process of learning. So it's a bit more complex. But yes, A and B above D and C. And that is exactly what the theoretical framework proposed by Mickey Chi. Come on, move forward. Right. So ICAP framework is probably the most comprehensive framework by Mickey Chi and colleagues. And they say, well, active learning, this is basically a hierarchy of active learning. So starting from passive, active, constructive, interactive. And ICAP is just the acronym backwards. So interactive, constructive, active, passive. So the best to the worst, right? So passive receiving would be listening to stuff, reading text messages, watching videos. That's passive. Yeah, that's how they defining passive. I must say here that passive is sort of a wrong choice of word, because the mind is not passive when it's actually listening, reading, or watching. It is active. So instead of calling it passive, I think it's just a low level of active learning, or a low degree of active, because the mind cannot be passive if it's listening, reading, or watching things. It is active, right? So it's just a wrong label for the cognitive process that's going on. So, but it's low inactive activities, right? So that's passive. Active could be manipulating. So you can repeat what you've learned, you can rehearse it, you can take notes, you can underline or highlight, summarize things, manipulate it, and so on. So you're not just reading, listening, but you're actually doing something on top of that. So, but within the thing that has been given to you. All right. So that's active manipulating is one. So that's better than just receiving. Then we move to constructive or generating stuff. So that is you're reflecting out loud. You're drawing concept maps to capture the gist and the structure. You're asking questions. You're explaining to yourself or to others. You're explaining concepts in the video, comparing and contrasting things. So these are given something. You're generating more knowledge, ideas, explanations, maps, representations on top of that. Okay, so that's constructive. That's the constructive level of the framework. And finally, there is the interactive or the dialogic level of the framework, where you're not just working alone with yourself, but you're defending and arguing in dyads or small groups. You're asking and answering questions. Maybe you're engaging in debates and discussing similarities and differences. And again, the interactive is good to the extent that people know how to interact, because interaction comes with a cost. Okay, so just that caveat. But the framework is really nicely laid out. It's simple, and its beauty is in its simplicity and parsimony. And it predicts that if you were to look at any learning situation or a learning program, the extent to which you have a distribution of these 4 categories, passive, active, constructive, interactive, that would kind of correlate with the depth of learning that you will get at the end of the day, right? So that's how, to me, this is the most comprehensive way of thinking about, or comprehensive framework for thinking about what is active learning. Now, if you think about the first 2 categories, their students are just working with the givens. You're given a video, you're given text passages, you're watching, you're listening to something, you may be rehearsing the same thing, copying something, you're underlining or highlighting it, but you're working with the given information, with the given representations or problems or text or whatever. But if you look at the second part, you're going beyond that. And I think I said this earlier, you're generating stuff on top of what is the problem or the text or the video. You're actually making gists out of it. You're drawing concept maps, you're explaining things to yourself and to others, you're comparing and contrasting. In other words, you're creating new knowledge, new representations, new ideas, new explanations on top of what is given, right? So this is like another layer that you can start to think about, that if you design learning experiences where people are more in the generate side of things rather than working within the givens side of things, then learning should be better. Now, the problem with this is, or the question here is, does this help you design for learning? Like, does it tell you, okay, how do you design the activities? How do you design the interaction? How do you design the culture within which all of this is going to take place? What are the principles for that design? This framework doesn't do this. It's a very top level framework that merely, you can think of it as an analytical framework that you can apply looking back at what you've done and say, oh, actually, we seem to be very leaning far towards the first 2 categories and not the generative end of the framework, and therefore we shouldn't be expecting deep learning outcomes. So you can use it as an analytical framework, but as teachers, as designers of learning, it does not help you design for learning. And one way that we think about, and you can have many designs that can come out of it. One of the designs on the generate side of this continuum is productive failure, right? So the idea behind productive failure is simple, that if learning from failure is intuitive, it's so compelling, then why do we wait for it to happen? What if we could deliberately design for it? So again, it's in the context of initial learning. When you're first coming to understand something new, you're a novice, you don't know that. We know from research that just telling you exactly what that concept is and explaining to you in a very good way that still leads to shallow learning, what do you do? So if success doesn't work, let's design for failure. So failure-based activation is the idea that I started to do my research on, right? And so it's a two-phase design. So now we're going into, it's not just a framework, it's not just a logic model, it's actually a design. It's a set of design principles that say learning ought to be designed in these two phases minimally. That problem solving, a generation or an exploration phase, many of you noted that from the key takeaways of the first part, that before you have instruction, you must have a generation and exploration phase, right? And the students engage in problem solving before, and then the instruction has to happen where the teacher or the expert or a video can consolidate and assemble based on what students have generated. So productive failure then becomes a design framework for designing learning that can potentially lead to better outcomes, right? So the idea here is you design failure in the initial learning so that you learn better, so that when failure matters, or when failure is in high stakes situations, the likelihood of failure then is reduced. Okay, so that's the logic model of the design. Now, as a design, so you have to specify, as I mentioned, you have to design, okay, is productive failure about giving any problem solving activity? Or can I throw any hard activity, any challenging activity at students? The answer is no. There are certain principles, and I'm not going to go into that for this webinar. There are certain principles that by which the activity should be designed. There are certain features, and I'm working with IL and adult educators, and I've worked with schools in Singapore and around the world as well, where we've trained teachers and designers to design activities based on the productive failure principles and iterate over time to get it in the sweet spot where it starts to work really well. So it's not just any challenging activity. It has to have a set of features that make it a productive failure problem. Then we need to design the interaction. How do learners interact with the activity? How do they interact with each other? How do they interact with the expert? What kinds of facilitation, what kinds of participant structures do we need to put in place? Just putting people in groups or having brainstorming, that is not productive failure. You have to follow the principles that we've researched over the years. And if you do that, chances are you will increase your fidelity to productive failure. And it is essentially a cultural activity. So productive failure can't take place without setting up safe space for students to explore and think and tinker and fail and then learn, right? So these norms and expectations have to be properly put in. In fact, the unit of design or the unit of change is culture. You change the culture, you change how people interact, and you allow for certain kinds of activities that are more productive for learning to carry out easily. Right, so that's the design. Again, this is just one slide. There's a paper on it if you like, but it's an entirely different talk if I go deep into it. But I will give you an example of what it looks like in a school classroom, right? So this is how it goes. Again, if you've been in my talks before, you've probably seen this example, so just bear with it. So here we have a case where students are learning the concept of standard deviation in mathematics. These are grade 8 or 9, so Sec 3 or Sec 4, Sec 2 to 4 students, depending on when it's covered in the curriculum. Now, if the teacher was in direct instruction mode, he or she would come in the classroom and say, hey, today's a lesson on standard deviation. Here is what it is. Here are some examples, explain the properties, show how to calculate the formula and so on, and give you problems for practice and provide feedback, etc. In productive failure, we know that model is not optimal. So we design an activity, a challenging activity, where we say, okay, here are 3 football players. Here are a number of, here's the number of goals each of them has scored over a number of years in the league. And your job is to invent as many ways of deciding who's the most consistent striker. So not one way, but as many ways as possible. Don't worry about getting it right or wrong. Just focus on generating ideas and as many ideas as possible. Okay, so if you were a secondary school student who had not even heard the concept of standard deviation, who did not know that yet, what would you do? Right. So let me show you what students typically do. So they take totals, they calculate totals, right? So totals are very intuitive, but we've kept the totals the same. by design. They take averages. We also have kept the averages the same. So, and that's one of the features of these problems, is where we know the prior, we anticipate certain priors that will come into the problem solving activity, and we make the problem not solvable with those priors, so that they reach a hurdle, they reach a failure moment, and they say, oh, I tried to use what I knew, but this doesn't work to solve the problem. So maybe I have to think of something else, right? So they go into tallying. Tallying is another thing that comes very naturally, very intuitively. They draw polygons if they've learned that previously in school. And again, these are not precise measures, but they give you a very good feel of who the more consistent player is. So for example, in this case, Ivan, who's either very good or very bad, is not as consistent as, say, Dave, who is kind of bunched up in the center, and Mike is somewhere in the middle, right? So you can get a qualitative feel. And again, that's a good way of thinking, of feeling your way through mathematics. It's the activity, it's the disciplinary practices of mathematics, but then you need to push towards quantifying it, make it precise, which is what mathematicians do. Graph drawing is also very typical, and students can say, oh, if it goes up and down a lot, it's more inconsistent. If it stays the same, it's not as consistent. It's more consistent. And we say, okay, that's a good way to get a feel of the problem. Can you quantify it? Can you be more precise? If you had 100 players, would you have 100 intuitions about who's better? So okay, right, let's try to quantify. So again, pushing them towards the mathematical precision. Then people calculate, range or maximum minus minimum. Again, we know that they're going to use this, so we make the problem not solvable. They reach that moment. Every time they produce something, ideally it is the failure signal is very strong, that, oh, clearly it doesn't work, or through facilitation, they understand that the method is suboptimal. Then you get year-on-year, sum of year-on-year deviations is one of the methods, where they just take 1 year from the next and they calculate what's the difference, like a fluctuation from 1 year to year. So if this fluctuation stream, and they add up all the values, if this value is small, they say, oh, the total fluctuation is small and therefore it's more consistent. Others note that, oh, look, large fluctuations, positive and negative, are canceling each other out. So maybe we should ignore the signs altogether and take an average. So they take the average magnitude of fluctuation in the distribution and they calculate the values. That's also a reasonable solution. And sometimes you get very creative solutions as well. So here, when we pushed that group of students to quantify the graph, they said, okay, imagine we can hold the ends of the graph. Now imagine we could extend the graph into a rope. What if we could do that? And what if we could calculate the length of that rope? So the longer the rope, the more inconsistent. And so if you see those who are mathematically inclined here, what they've done is they've created right angle triangles all the way, I think 19 or 20 of them, and calculated the hypotenuses using the Pythagoras theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and they've calculated these values as the length of the rope. Now, to this day, I've never bothered to check whether the computation here is correct, and it's been 20 years almost. And the reason is simple, because the mathematics here is not in the computation. The computation doesn't even make sense. You can't combine number of goals with years on the same scale. So it doesn't make sense. But the real mathematics is in the play. It's in the play of imagination. It's in the creativity. And all of this is happening, mind you, in the first 30 to 45 minutes before they even have been taught anything on this concept. That's all it takes, 30 to 45 minutes of this activity. It could be even shorter, right? If the activity is designed well, given the constraints of curricula and time. But that's all it takes. And this is what students can produce if the productive failure problem or the activity is designed really well. And usually it takes 2 to 3 iterations for you to be able to come to an activity and the design principles that work really nicely, okay? Now, if students produce this, the question then is, does this work? Of course, if we leave it just alone like this, they will not have learned anything. But if at this point the instruction comes in, because remember, the productive failure is a two-phase model. What I just showed you was the first phase, where students are engaged in problem solving, they're generating and exploring representations and solutions and so on and so forth. But that alone is not sufficient. The teacher or the expert then has to come in and give instruction, consolidate, and teach them the correct way of doing things, right? And so to figure out or to answer the question, does it work? That's an empirical question. And so we carry out experiments that compare, direct instruction with productive failure. So direct instruction, as I've already introduced, it's instruction followed by problem solving in a very generic way. That's the logic model. And in productive failure, it's problem solving, not just any problem solving, but problem solving design based on productive failure principle, followed by instruction, which is also designed based on productive failure principles. So what's the theoretical matchup? Like, why should we expect? So in any behavioral or learning experiments, there are usually reasons, there are usually mechanisms that, would predict that one condition would do better than the other. And that is the same here. So in direct instruction, there's a big theoretical framework called cognitive load theory. That suggests that the reason why direct instruction is the reason why you should tell exactly what to the novice what to do and how to do it is that it lowers the cognitive load on the working memory, which is limited, so that the learner can process information and store it in the long-term memory. And so you have better schema acquisition. So that's one of the main reasons why direct instruction should work. Then it's also, it lowers the likelihood of encoding misconceptions. If you give students a chance to attack problems, generate their own ideas and solutions, well, many of them would be naive ideas or misconceived ideas. What if you, in the act of generation, students start to encode that information also, and they keep it with them? Now that's a danger. So in direct instruction, you're lowering the likelihood of that happening, that misconceptions or errors are encoded. And because the information is being given to you, there's lower likelihood of frustration and disengagement. You don't have to struggle with anything. You don't have to figure anything out or anything like that, and that should make for better learning. So that's the direct instruction theoretical mechanisms. In productive failure, the logic is, well, if you give students a chance to produce multiple solutions, multiple ideas or representations or different ways of thinking about, it leads to better activation and differentiation. You're thinking about the same thing in different ways, right? And this differentiation is very important because it's the differentiation that allows you to focus on what is critical and what is not. I can't teach you what a table is by just showing you what a table is. I have to show you something that is a table and something that is not a table, and ideally some representations in between where it's a bit blurred. That's when you start to focus your attention to the features that make a table versus those that do not, right? And so this differentiation is key because that would lead to better encoding of things that actually matter, not of superficial features, but the key features, the critical features. And there's better retrieval. So in the cognitive architecture, we make a distinction between storage and retrieval. So methods that improve storage are not the same methods that improve retrieval. You can store a lot of information, but there's no point if you can't retrieve that information. And I'm sure as educators, everybody can relate to this. So this is a point not about storage, but about retrieval. When you have a wide exploration net, you have a wider activation network. If there's a queue in the environment that activates this network, there are multiple paths because it's wider and more connected. There are multiple paths through this network to the knowledge that you're trying to seek, which is not the case. So retrieval strength of productive failure, precisely the thing that matters when you want to move to new contexts and novel problems, that is better, right? So that's the theoretical matchup. What do we find empirically in experiments? We find, and we track three kinds of, so these are randomized control experiments. These are quasi experiments in the classrooms. And what I'm sharing with you is just the generic finding before going into aggregate meta-analysis, which I'll get to in a bit, right? So the generic finding is that if you compare students on basic knowledge, this is the kind of knowledge that will come out on tests and exams, both methods seem to be very proficient in the same amount of time, with working with the same materials, with the same teacher, and so on, are very proficient in developing high levels of basic knowledge, above 90%. So people learn. So clearly direct instruction works. It's optimized for basic knowledge, as is productive failure, which is also seems to be equally optimized for basic knowledge. The difference turns out in conceptual understanding and transfer. So do you understand why, say, the formula is formulated, why the construct is defined this way, or what if you change something? Can you debug a solution, so on and so forth? That's conceptual understanding. That's where productive failure outperforms, significantly outperforms direct instruction. But the biggest effects are for transfer, when you have to go to novel situations where you're either tackling problems that require concepts that are more advanced than what you've learned, or they're entirely novel contexts. And we know from research in education and in cognition, in learning, and in education, that transfer is very hard for people and it's very rare. And one of the things that actually aids transfer is cueing. And I talked about queuing as one of the mechanisms earlier, right? So it turns out the queuing is an important mechanism, and transfer is kind of tuned to that. So that's a very strong effect that we have. Now, this is just my studies, and we don't make changes in scientific theory and models just because Manu said so. It doesn't work like that, right? So when I first published my paper back in 2008, the scientific community didn't say, well, let's take this on. Well, they say, yeah, we'll take this on, but we'll try to falsify it. Let's see if this holds under other conditions and other topics and other continents and other cultures and so on and so forth. So about a couple of years ago, with my then PhD student and now postdoc, Tanmay Sinha, we embarked on a meta-analysis that says, okay, it's been about 15, 16 years since this body of work has started. What is the state of the art? And so we gathered 166 experimental comparisons comparing productive failure with direct instruction. As you can see, work has gone on around the world. Well, not entirely around the world, but at least in 4 continents. And we found that the average effect size was 0.34 in favor of productive failure. And if productive failure was carried out to high fidelity, which is what I mentioned in the design, like not anything is productive failure, it has to follow the features, then if the implementation was with high fidelity to PF principles, then the effect size was almost 0.58. Let me put this in context and what is achievable, what is normally achievable in educational interventions. So if you take the learning gain that one has, so imagine you were learning from a good teacher for a year, and you could somehow quantify the gain before and after the year to 1 unit, then the average effect of productive failure is twice that. And if productive failure is done with high fidelity, then it's 3 times that. Right? So it's not an incremental. We're not saying you will learn 10% better or 20% better or 50% better. We're saying you learn 3 times better. Now that's not incremental, that's breakthrough. That's why it's astonishing that by simply changing the underlying logic model and overturning the success to the failure-based activation model, that you can really achieve breakthrough effects, right? And another way to benchmark this is that if productive failure were carried out on a regular basis, then in a year of productive failure interventions, your students will appear at least a year or 2 ahead of their peers who are in direct instruction. So there are significant practical benefits to carrying this out, and the science is very robust. So what are the learning mechanisms? Again, we go down at our fundamentals. So this is the fundamental research aspect, and we study mechanisms and sub-mechanisms and sub-mechanisms. And those are what PhDs and postdocs are made of. But I will put them into some umbrella set of mechanisms in a way that I can communicate them with some ease. So first mechanism is simply activation. We process information, new information, based on activation of our priors. If you don't have that activation, or if you can't activate anything from our long-term memory to bring to bear to new information that's been coming in, then that activation would not be. Then we won't be able to process it well. So what productive failure does is it's failure-based deliberate activation and differentiation. So you're thinking about the same thing in different ways. Now, in direct instruction, this does not happen. I mean, this also happens, of course, while I'm listening to a lecture up from the get-go. I'm also trying to make sense of the lecture back to, oh, do I know something about it? That's the only way to make sense of what is coming in, right? So think of productive failure as decoupling that and saying, let's just properly activate your cognitive system And then we'll give you the chance to process that information in relation to this activated cognition. So the activation is key, right? Because what we've also studied that it builds awareness. So when you widely activate and none of those activated structures lead to optimal solutions, then the student knows, oh, it or he or she develops an awareness. Oh, there is a gap here. You know, just that awareness of a gap is an important mechanism. And this again has several dimensions to it, but just broadly speaking, awareness is a big mechanism because it's also related to affect. And here an affect again gets operationalized in many different ways. So for example, we've studied having gone through the first phase of productive failure, the generation phase of productive failure, students' situational interest in learning about the correct solution goes through the roof. So they're really, I mean, having solved the problem in 4 or 5 different ways and none of them are working optimally, they're really interested to know, okay, what is the solution to this problem, simply put, right? So when they actually attend the lecture, their motivation or their orientation towards the lecture is different. You know, the kinds of questions that they ask, those are really understanding kinds of question, or mastery orientation, as we call it. They want to know why that method is working better than mine. They also go through a roller coaster of emotions. We've studied the dynamics of how people go on a roller coaster ride of emotions through the productive failure. So they have to struggle, they feel frustrated, they have to persist through that. Sometimes they feel angry, sometimes they feel shame, they feel guilty that they're not able to solve the problem. And we're used to thinking that learning should always be positive. Learning is associated with positive emotions. And it turns out that is simply not the case. Not just by making the emotional dynamics all positive does not mean you will always necessarily increase learning outcomes. In productive failure, we find that giving students these safe, and I must emphasize this, that safe, curated opportunities to experience struggle, to experience failure, to experience frustration, to experience shame, these turn out to be positively related with learning outcomes in our statistical analysis. So, we need to stop thinking about emotions and learning outcomes in a monotonically positive way. Right? So that's affect. So now imagine you have a student whose cognitive system is properly activated. They're aware there's a gap, and their affective mechanisms are more or less aligned to the assembly. That is when the teacher comes in and collects all this information, works with students' ideas, and assembles them into the canonical solution or canonical idea or the concept or whatever is the targeted thing for that lesson, right? So that's assembly. So these 4 mechanisms work together to make productive failure effective, right? So that's the end of the productive failure part before we go into the last third of my talk, which will try to bring all of these together in flipped learning. So I want you to think about active learning and productive failure. And as before, just share in the chat, what are some 2 or 3 ideas that stuck with you that you want to take back to your practice, right? So take a couple of minutes and put that down in the chat. All right. So I think in the interest of time, it's good that you are putting all of your takeaways down. Thank you. Let's continue. So one of the things I want to emphasize that in the first part of productive failure, where students are generating and exploring solutions, the goal of that phase is not to get to the correct answer. The goal is not that they will somehow discover something on their own. The goal is just activation and differentiation, just a wider activation. You just want them to explore the problem and the solution space as widely as possible. That's it. There's no expectation that they'll come to a correct answer. That will happen in the assembly, the consolidation phase. Right? So let's go into flipped learning now. So recently, and this is almost 5 years of work, we started examining flipped learning interventions because people had really caught on to that, and there's a lot of research on it. And I work with my colleagues, John Hattie, which I'm sure you've heard of, and his postdoc, Irina Grossman, and my postdoc, Tanmay Sinha. And we did a meta-analysis on flipped learning just to see what the state of the art there is, okay? And our goals were, just to study what does the effect say in relation to what actually gets implemented. So what is the promise, or what is the logic model of flipped learning? It is basically saying, well, we spend a lot of time in class giving lectures and direct instruction. Why don't we move this passive component to online so that we can reserve more time in class for active learning activities, right? Could be through the ICAP framework or whatever. So that's the basic logic model. But it turns out that the pedagogy is the same. It's the same as traditional direct instruction. I do not understand why people call it an innovation when the underlying pedagogy is exactly the same. So what are we doing? What is the, if I could represent direct instruction, it's really instruction followed by problem solving. That's the logic model. Typically in a classroom or in higher education, we do both of these in the face-to-face modality. The only thing that we've changed in the flipped learning is we've taken the instruction component and moved it online. We've just changed the modality of the instructional part, the passive part, moved it online, and then we reserve classroom activity for more problem solving and active learning, right? So the question that baffled me and John for a very long time was that if the underlying pedagogical model is the same, why on earth should there be a larger effect for direct instruction unless the modality makes such a huge difference? It simply does not make sense that just that changing the modality would make such a difference. So we decided to let's look at all the studies out there on flipped learning and see what we find. So we did a meta-analysis of 46 meta-analyses. So there are already 46 meta-analyses out in the field that were more or less suggesting that here is the effect size. So we did a meta-analysis of the 46 meta-analyses, and we found that there was a huge variation in the effects, right? So some were negative, some were 0, some were positive, and there was a huge variation, which basically means that there's no true effect size interpretable from that data. Okay. From here, we produced a list of 173 experimental studies where we can actually causally see. Not all studies have this property where they're designed well in a way that you can derive some kind of causal interpretation of the effect of the thing that you're trying to manipulate. So we sort of culled it down to 173 studies in the last 20 years or so. And we started to code because of this high heterogeneity, because there's so much variation in the effect sizes of flipped learning interventions. You can't have one thing. It must depend therefore on how it was implemented. So we started to code. We started to look at, okay, how are they describing flipped learning was carried out? What was done in the passive component? What was done in the active in the classroom component, and so on and so forth. So we looked at all the pre-class activities. So we had a range of activities that these 173 studies were reporting. So you had readings. So this is pre-class, right? So this is what's moved outside of class. So this involved readings, videos with quiz, videos with PowerPoints, and all combinations, online actual lectures, modules, assignments, exams, note that, PowerPoints, and so on. So this is all the prep stuff, pre-stuff, so that classroom could be, the in-class activities could be. more different. So what did we see in the in-class activities? We saw lectures, we saw laboratories, we saw demonstrations, problem-based use of clickers, problem solving, and so on and so forth. Okay, so imagine we went through all these 173 studies, and for each study we coded the activities into these categories, and then we added another layer of coding to define which is active, which is passive. Okay, and so our overall finding from these 173 studies is that there is a positive effect in favor of flipping. So the effect size is fairly strong, 0.41, which is like a year of school, or more than a year of school teaching. And the 95% confidence interval is 0.33 to 0.48. So that's a pretty solid effect size, I would say. But here's the thing. Again, we found even within the properly culled, properly selected experimental studies, we found significant heterogeneity. Again, it means that whatever 0.41 represents, there is no true effect size for flipped learning interventions, because the heterogeneity is like, if you have so much variation in a group, what is the meaning of the mean if there is so much variation in the group? Okay, so that's the idea. And the percentage of variance across the studies that's due to heterogeneity was rather large. Almost 91% of the variance was purely coming from heterogeneity, not by chance. So that's very large, right? So what does this mean? The codes, luckily we had coded the activities, right? So again, remember, the logic was passive online followed by active in class. What we found in our analysis, that the actual implementation, the reported implementation of flipped learning was passive online followed by more passive in class. Okay, what this means was that the quality of implementation was not consistent with its core claim. Yes, there is a positive effect size, but it isn't, the underlying activities are not passive and active, right? And we found actually, because we coded all the activities, very low prevalence of active learning, right? And when we put that in our regression models, we found that active learning did not predict the effect, was not significantly predicting the effect. So not only there was a low prevalence of active learning, there was active learning when it was present did not add to the effect. So it cannot be that active learning is responsible for that positive effect that we found, the average positive effect. What the positive effect was actually coming from was because almost all flipped learning interventions had that in-class lecture again, and that was what was contributing to the biggest, that was the biggest contribution to the variance in the learning outcomes. So the greatest impact of flipped learning was that the in-class included a lecture, right? And so conversely, we found that in some interventions, when they added more active learning in a traditional direct instruction, the effect of flipped learning vanished, right? So what it means is you really need to focus on doing active learning rather than flipping in one way or the other, right? But if you must flip, at least what we've seen the evidence so far, flipped learning has basically digitized learning without transforming it. It's the same logic model, it's the same pedagogy, and it's more passive than active. And even though we're getting an effect, a positive effect of learning, that is effect that is coming more from more exposure to task, more exposure time to content, and so on and so forth. It's not coming from active learning strategies. But there was one effect that was significantly predicting learning outcomes, and that was when flipped learning had problem-solving activities prior to the in-class lecture, right? And we thought, oh, okay, if you're including problem-solving activities prior to the lecture, and that's predicting some variance of the effect of flipped learning, then that is very consistent with productive failure. So the question then became, how do we design flipped learning using the PF model? So not all the implementations were terrible, but there were a set of implementations where they didn't report on productive failure, but just by the way they designed it, they include problem solving prior to in-class. So we worked to, distill this model from the meta-analysis, which we call the 4F model, which stands for fail, flip, form, and feed. And I'll briefly describe this now. So basically in the fail phase, you're trying to cultivate a culture of exploration and resilience. You're engaging students in problem solving. You're creating a psychologically safe space, as one of you said, allow students to discover the limits of their knowledge. And the role of the instructor is to design these problem-solving activities that are ideally based on productive failure principles or case studies that students can explore and generate ideas and solutions to. Right? So that's the fail phase. Then you're going into the flip phase. So having done that, you can then provide students with readings and videos and quizzes or lectures. And as I shared with you, research shows that students who go through the fail phase are likely to learn more from the flip phase than students who go straight to the flip phase. So it's really important to do the fail and then the flip, right? Because students can start to compare and contrast understandings, and that leads to better encoding and so on and so forth. Then you go to the fix phase, and this is where to the form. Sorry, there's a typo. So the form phase where students come to the class and you're kind of reintegrating lectures into the class. And these are not traditional lectures because the traditional part should have been given in the flip phase, right? This is really where you're helping students make sense of what they did in the fail phase, what they learned in the flip phase, the contrast, and help them consolidate that. And that's where active learning forms the core. It's not just about more passive lecturing. And finally, the feed phase, and this is part of the regular constructive feedback that you need to give students. It could be homework, could be problem solving, and so on and so forth, right? This could also be integrated with other phases. It doesn't have to be as sequential. So this is the entire model that we are inviting the community based on research on productive failure. And mind you, we didn't go looking for the productive failure effect in this meta-analysis. It just was there and we found it, okay? This was a big surprise, and this is how we came up with this model. So we invite you, if you're going to do flipped learning interventions, we invite you to follow this model and try to test it in real ecologies. Now, how does this compare with productive failure? Remember, productive failure was problem-solving activities followed by instruction based on PF principles. In the 4F model, the fail happens first, the first red block, then instruction, that's the flip. Then the form and the feed are more orange because they're a mix of both. Okay, so that's the kind of model that this goes. But do you see that in all this talk about the 4F model, we've deliberately left one element out? And what might that be? We've deliberately left modality out, meaning that you can do any of these. I mean, some are more ideal for us. So flip could be definitely online, but we've left that modality out. So if you were to carry out the 4F model entirely in your face-to-face class, it should work just as well if you should flip one of those components. Okay, so that's deliberately left out so that you can test the model, whether the flipping of just the content actually makes a difference, and I suspect it would not. But the underlying pedagogical model has to be sound. I think that's the idea here. Right, so we tested this model at my university, ETH Zürich, and we worked with a first-year linear algebra course for mechanical engineers. These are large lecture groups, 600, 700 students, and we chose linear algebra because it's a really tough course. It's very abstract, and all bachelor students have to take this linear algebra course, right? And this course has a typical direct instruction that you and I are familiar with. We probably went through this lecture tutorial system, and it's a year-long course, so it's a really heavy course. And the way we designed was, we said, okay, let's design the fail. It's obviously missing the first step, the fail. You can see the lecture as the flip, and you can see the tutorial as form and feed. Okay, so those components were there. We needed a bit of redesign, but we needed to introduce the fail. So we asked the lecturer to, give us 5 big ideas in the first semester of the year and 5 big ideas in the second semester of the year. And these are the core ideas that students needed to learn, okay, deeply. And for these ideas, we designed the fail, the problem solving. PS stands for problem solving. We designed the problem solving based on productive failure principles, right? And so these problem solving exercises each of them was about 30 to 40 minutes, just like I said. So over the course of the year, there were 10 of those. So total investment of time by a student in this was about 7 to 8 hours maximum in a course that takes hundreds of hours over the year. So it's a very heavy course. Okay, our intervention using the 4F model was only 7 to 8 hours in a course that takes hundreds of hours. Historically, this course is very tough. It's 55% passing rate. This would be unheard of in Singapore, but the system here for universities is anybody with a Matura or like an A-level graduate can enter the university. There's no stopping. But at the end of the year, there is an exam where it's harder to stay in the university if you don't meet that standard. So entry is easy, staying in is hard, which is why historical passing rate for this course is 55%. And this is one of the toughest courses. So here I want to ask you, if in a year-long course that has historically a passing rate of only 55%, and it carries out over hundreds of hours, if you include a very small surgical intervention at 10 times in the course of the program, surgically tied to a key idea, what would be an impressive jump, if at all, in the passing rate? Okay. Now, in the first iteration, we were able to achieve a 10% jump. And notice the effect sizes, they are almost identical to the average effect size of productive failure in our meta-analysis. In the second iteration, we were able to achieve 20% increase, which again is very consistent with the 0.6 effect that we saw in the meta-analysis. And during the pandemic, so this is until 2020, in the pandemic in 2021, it dipped to 15%, and now it's back up to 20%. So 20%, and that is a huge effect, and it's very consistent with what we found in the meta-analysis, right? So that brings me to the final bit. So now we've talked about the problems, we've talked about active learning and productive failure, and then we talked about this deep dive into flipped learning and what is the state of the field in flipped learning and how we derived the 4F model from it. So now it's your last chance here to write down some key takeaways. And I suppose, Nilanjana, given the time, we can also, or do you think we should go straight into a discussion?
Yes.
All right. So let's just, the takeaways are for you to think about, and then we can go straight into the discussion or questions or thoughts and comments you might have. So thank you very much. Nilanjana, over to you.
Okay, great. That's great. Thank you, Prof, for this rather enriching. I mean, we've been taking notes, I guess, everyone here. So what's interesting is that even though ICAP is a very comprehensive framework, yet how you use it for flipped learning and how you bring the fail, flip, fix, and feed has raised a lot of questions and thoughts in the comments as well as the Q&A. I see folks raising questions, so maybe I will just go through some of the questions and we'll invite your thoughts. So I think a couple of questions are coming up on the differences, if there are any, of productive failure with problem-based learning, and how might it be different, in cognitive levels, and also with experiential learning.
Yeah. So productive failure it's a very specific failure-based activation mechanism that does certain things to the cognitive architecture, and that prepares you to learn. And there are certain ways of assembling, again, based on certain principles. So if you're following that model, then that's productive failure. PBL is very broad. If PBL does not necessarily lead to failure, PBL has strong guidance from the get-go, so it's guided problem solving as well. In productive failure, we deliberately do not do that. So there are lots of differences between PBL and PF. PBL has its own meta-analysis that is not as robust because of the different ways in which PBL gets carried out. But there are very distinct differences between PF and PBL because of this attention to failure-based activation. I think that's the key that we designed for in a safe space. Experiential learning, I don't even know why people talk about it, because it has no empirical basis at all. The empirical studies on it are very weak. So I really, it's just another framework. Anybody can prepare a framework. I know it's very popular, but the evidentiary basis of it is rather weak at all. So it does not, we shouldn't even compare the things that don't even have evidentiary basis.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what about culture and productive failure? So culturally, it is tough to discuss failures about what went wrong, the struggles. Any advice on how can we make it easier?
Yeah, well, that somebody mentioned in the chat, like psychological safety is key. So the third layer that you need to really change the classroom culture, you don't just carry out productive failure, you really have to renegotiate the didactic contract. You explain to students what you're doing, why you're trying to do. We did this with the IAL adult educator interventions as well. You really need to have a conversation about how you're changing the classroom culture, the activities and the interaction, what's valued, what's not, and so on. And that takes a long time. So you have to persist with it to change it. But to the extent that you can create this safe space and change the culture, which is more aligned with what the productive failure is trying to do, then we find that students take to it very naturally, very easily. So we've not felt any resistance other than from the very high performing, high achieving schools and students. For them to go into this, because that's a big change of the game, right? They're used to the direct instruction game. They are there in that space, in those high achieving schools, because they're very good at that game, right? And it's a good game. And so getting them to change is harder because they have a lot more to, let's say, lose. But actually, even in that group, we have shown very positive effects and some of the most amazing effects. And I think there was a question here on lower ability students or lower achieving students. We find that the effects are very strong in the lower achieving students. In fact, what we found that incoming differences in achievement stop predicting how much you learn from productive failure. And what really matters is what students do in the productive failure intervention. We just published a paper in Nature Science of Learning from the Singapore sample, actually, that taking schools who are very far apart on the PSLE, when we gave them productive failure interventions, they became very similar in terms of learning outcomes. So just to answer that question in tandem.
So just one comment. I think maybe you could unshare your screen.
Okay.
Everyone wants to, yeah. And then there's question on what about one's learning styles? Example, activist, assimilator, converger, diverger. Does that affect whether, am I audible? Does that affect the direct instruction or productive failure designs work better for whom?
So learning styles is another concept or a construct that we should entirely abandon from our vocabulary. There is robust research in psychological science that in two ways. One, we all have a preference. It's a very robust, stable preference. We think that we have a learning style. So, okay, you have a preference, no big deal. That's not a major finding. But from a learning standpoint, every time, every experiment where they've tried to match the instruction with the learning style has not given any effect whatsoever. I know it's $1 billion industry, but the last thing we should be looking at right now is learning styles. Learning styles are just preferences that we have, but they have no relevance to how you design learning. I know it's very counterintuitive, but the scientific evidence is very strong. What you should be designing learning is in relation to prior knowledge, prior experiences, informal ways of thinking, and histories that students bring into, not learning styles.
Okay. So would the same analogy and thinking also go towards, the left side, it is the more creative and the right are more, because those are kind of terminologies that we've also heard.
Yes, I mean, there's some neural basis for it, but again, to what extent differences, and we study that the differences at the neural level actually have implications for how you design. It's very weak. It's like saying at the quantum level, the molecules are behaving in a certain way, and that has implications for how you design a table. It has because the layer is so deep within the phenomena that it usually doesn't have any upward effects on how you design learning. So neuroscience is really good to understand the basic mechanisms, which we do in my research, but we don't take those findings and say, because of these findings, we must now design differently. That is a bridge too far still. I know people do that, but the consensus in the field is it's too many layers far. So it's very good descriptive or explanatory models that you develop. It's very good science, but we should be careful in saying, because of this neuroscience finding, we need to now teach differently. That's not what the goal there is. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you, Prof. So which means learning sciences, I'm just reading off a question and a comment, which is relating to this point made. And it's actually talking about learning sciences research appears to be a bit technical. So how do we translate these research into practice, and especially maybe adult learning practice? And there's another one comment that, given there is so much misinformation about education and learning that is out here.
So in learning sciences, as I said at the outset, we take two commitments. One is to do fundamental science, right? And then we do the applications. And the applications component, there is a commitment to designing. So the bridge is from the science to the practice is the design component. So as somebody who has investigated productive failure, I'm not just looking at productive failure at the neural level, at the cognitive level, and searching those mechanisms. I'm putting out a set of principles and working with teachers and educators. Here are the design principles. So if I want you to design a Lamborghini, for example, then here are the principles by which you don't just design any car. If you want to design a Lamborghini or an F1 or Ferrari, then here are the principles. Here are the features that car must have. And let me work with you so that you can understand what these features are. The work that I've done with schools and teachers in Singapore, the work that I've done with IAL, and the work that I'm doing here, it always involves this design component as well. I, as a learning scientist, design bridges the science with the practice. And that's why I kept emphasizing the design principles are the key for you to take the science and embody them into your practice.
All right. So, okay. So I think that there's another leading. So does one need any prior qualifications to imbibe learning sciences, or we can, because there is research out there. So, or qualifications.
Well, the thing is, research that's out there generally tends to be the science of something. There are very few designs. So the science of learning and the design of learning are two separate components. So if you can find papers where do both, where they either report the science and then they actually specify the design principles, then it's the design that should be easier to take and apply into one's context. Yes, but taking the science and deriving implications directly for practice sometimes can be quite hard. So you really need the design layer in the middle. So design papers are useful. You don't need as much of the science papers. Yeah.
Okay. And that recalls, or rather rings the bell, that there is your paper, which is about learning science principles for everyone in practice.
Yes, we just published a paper with Ido Roll from Technion in Israel, and that's really a design paper for educators. You don't have to go into the science at all. It's really a set of design principles that if you wanted to bring in the learning sciences into your practice, here are some principles to follow. And I think you've shared that paper with everybody, Nilanja, that chapter with everybody. But that entire book is amazing as well, because it's all different bodies, all different psychological scientists focusing on the design layer.
Okay, so now I'll take another question, which is about mindset. So the question is, I work with science lecturers in universities who do not see anything wrong with traditional lecture and tutorial system, where a huge chunk of knowledge is given during lectures and then tutorials, and students have the opportunity to work on problems and apply that knowledge. I'm wondering, what is a good angle to start to help them change this mindset?
No, those are the very hard people to change. It baffles me to this day that presenting scientific evidence to scientists doesn't help them change their own practice. It's really baffling. So which tells you that the way we teach or the way we think about education and learning is so deeply connected to how our own experiences, our own philosophies, our own ideologies Yeah, so that's really hard. So the best way, I don't even know if the best way is scientific evidence, but really the way we would do it in ETH and in Switzerland is to partner with these scientists. So I partner with a math professor to design a math intervention in using learning sciences principle. I work with a biology professor to do the same. I work with the medical school to do the same. So the idea is we create with the domain specialists projects, intervention projects that take the learning sciences principles to solve a problem in their context, generate evidence in that context using scientific research as the basis, and we lay out the evidence. And this is hopefully a much better way, at least in the higher education sector, to bring more people from the domains into the fold. And it does. So the learning intervention that we designed for math is now going to stay on. The learning intervention we designed in medical program, it's going to stay on. In biology, it stays on, and so on and so forth. So this actually works to take, we don't think of education or the practice of education as a scientific activity, but this is one way of making it a scientific activity. And then whichever way the evidence falls, because it falls in their own context, they're more likely to take it up.
Okay, so the next is, can we differentiate instruction in PF based, yeah, I know I think based on different learning abilities, any examples or strategies? I think maybe they're trying to hedge on that, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
So can we differentiate instruction? Is there a differentiated way of doing PF for different learning abilities?
So far, we've applied this. So the differentiation is built into the design, because when you're designing the activities, the interaction, it's always on an iterative basis, so that you design, say, a problem, and you pilot it with your students and you see what they produce, and then you based on how they went at the problem, what they produced, you refine the design in relation to what they produced and how they worked on the problem. So that differentiation automatically happens because the iterative design process is built into how you design, how you build, how you bring productive failure to high fidelity. So that's the way differentiation is built in. The same problem that works in school A may not work in school B. You need to pilot and reiterate and refine, because that's how it is. That's how we differentiate.
Okay. So what's the relevance of flipped learning in the future of learning, and what might it look like 10 to 15 years from now? And another sub-question, attention span is reducing and with greater distractions. So how can we try to, keep our learners engaged, especially adult learners?
So on the second one, attention span, there are two things. If you talk about like a behavior, then yes, the behavior modification has happened so that we are not able to pay attention. But if you think of attention span as a capacity of the human cognitive architecture, that has not changed. Okay, there's no, I mean, all this social media and everything, that's only happened in the last few decades, right? That is not evolutionary from an evolutionary standpoint to change our cognitive architecture, but behaviors can change. So our behaviors have changed. So it's good to know that we have the capacity, but our behaviors don't reflect that capacity, right? So we shouldn't say students don't have the attention span. We say students are behaving in ways that their attention spans are not optimized or not used, right? So that's one way to think about it. Then the previous question, could you remind me again, Angela, what was that?
What's the relevance of flipped learning?
Yeah,
in the future?
Yeah, so if we continue to do flipped learning in a way that's mostly passive, and especially with generative AI, and we've all have heard of ChatGPT, and I talked about expertise. Remember, I talked about explicit and tacit knowledge. And if the bulk of our learning environments or learning activities are designed on explicit knowledge, then we won't be needing teachers anymore. In a very like humble way, I think advanced technologies now and in the future would force us to really find a niche of what we're really good at, and that is tacit, the coupling of the explicit with the tacit in rich social activity. And so the flipped learning, in the flipped learning system, as long as you follow the pedagogical model of the 4F model, you have this coupling of the explicit and tacit. You have a choice which ones you want to make it online, which ones you want to have and make it face-to-face. We would recommend that you flip the online, but that's it. But otherwise, there is no commitment. You can also do it entirely face-to-face. So again, flipped learning, if you follow the 4F model, our conjecture is it would overcome the explicit tacit decoupling that normally happens in the direct instruction pedagogical model, which the current flipped learning model follows.
Okay. So now that brings me, since you mentioned ChatGPT, this has been a question that I would really like to ask. So, I mean, GPT is all here, generative AI is here. So how are we assessing in this age where generative AI is inescapable? There was an article by the University of Sydney that I read, and it was talking about that we should not be, we should refraining from assessing learning artifacts and more towards assessing learning processes. So how might that look like? Assessment in the age of generative AI.
Yeah, so I have students who are working on large language models, and I think their biggest opportunities are not in learning per se, and not even in learning processes. It's in it's what we're now calling learn agility. It's the ability to learn how to learn new things that are hard, and you need to learn it fast and in a resourceful manner. And so we're trying to design assessment systems that measure not just learning, but also the ability to learn new things, which would naturally implicate tools and resources and so on and so forth into the mix. And so we're trying to build the framework, both the theoretical, the underlying model, as well as the design framework for assessing these things in the generative AI world. But I think it's going to be about learn agility, not learning processes.
So that I think would be very interesting, as in, this entire. Okay, another question on, I think it's on PF. So does this style of PF work for adult learners, especially if they are trying to learn a foreign language? Right.
So actually the best second language learning module is immersion, right? I mean, that's known that if you want to learn, do not take up Duolingo, go to the place and learn. But sometimes it's not possible to do that. Immersion is the best. And when you have immersion, it's pretty much mimics how a child learns their first one or two languages, and productive failure is built into that natural learning environments. You don't go around teaching a child, oh, here are words and here's grammar and here are rules. No, you engage them in activity and through their natural propensities and of wanting to do things and play with things and learn, the language acquisition happens, right? There's a lot of effort on error correction in language learning, overgeneralization in language learning, and the situatedness of language learning. And I think so if adults want to learn new languages, then a productive failure-based model of a language learning that situates learning in, actual situations that we may encounter, then that's a very good model to learn. But I haven't seen any app that does that.
Okay. Another interesting question. If we don't have time for a proper PF, can we do a quick activation of prior knowledge exercise, like a mini quiz, and achieve similar productive failure results?
Two things. A, then it's no longer productive failure. B, depends on what you quiz on. If you're quizzing backwards, so diagnostic quizzing. So, what do you know up until now? I've taught you 10 topics, diagnostic, and I'm going to teach you the 11th topic, but let me just find out, what do you know on the 10 topics? Diagnostics, okay? So that's one way of quizzing. The other way of quizzing is, let me test you on the 11th topic itself. What do you know? Like, I know you haven't taught you yet, but what do you know about the 11th topic? Now, between these two, research shows, and this is called the pre-testing effect, by the way, research shows that if you quiz before teaching a concept or a lesson, problems on that very concept before teaching then that has retrieval values that are useful. So the act of not just the mere, even if students give a blank answer, the fact that they know that they could not solve the problem, it makes them more tuned to the lecture later on. But that's not PF, it's just a retrieval testing effect that we call it in literature. So yes, by all means do that.
Okay. Coming to feedback, could you share what might a constructive feedback look like? Because we've talked about the Goldilocks zone or the zone of proximal development for learning, but what about feedback?
Yeah, so feedback, so in domain-based, the way I think about feedback is feedback needs to be aligned with disciplinary practices. So when, for example, students are working on mathematics, I'll just give you the example that I'm most familiar with. They produce a solution and they see that it doesn't work, right? Then how would you facilitate that? So one of the first things we do is, okay, how would mathematicians work on this? What is their practice? We'd say, okay, can you explain the solution to me, right? And then maybe that will lead them to another solution which they think that works. And so then mathematician, what would mathematical practice dictate? We would say, can you think of a situation where your solution might not work? So we always look for the counterfactual as a very scientific or a mathematical thing we do. So, and this kind of practices are things that we need to design for in the actual learning environment as well. And they guide us into how we facilitate and guide and provide feedback to students. And every different domain, and different domains have their different practices. Lee Shulman had this idea of signature pedagogy. So if you're designing a law classroom versus an architect classroom or an engineer classroom, you really have to look back at the engineering practices and the architectural practices and the legal, what is common across these in your particular domain, and say, how do I bring this way of thinking and working with knowledge and tools and people into the classroom from the get-go? Because that will achieve the coupling of the explicit and the tacit. Is those practice. The practice actually couples the explicit with the tacit, but it has to be done together, not tacit followed by explicit. Yeah.
Right. Okay, another question is on modular short courses. So these days, there are more and more of short courses, especially for adult learners. Duration is short. And in this context, it becomes really tough for us to implement the 4F model in practice or PF in practice. What might your tips, suggestions be to make this a bit simpler and practical?
Look, it depends on your learning goals. I mean, sometimes the learning goals are not aligned with the goals of the learning model. So, when I work with teachers or educators, you need to have a conversation. What is your if the learning goal is deep learning and transfer and adaptive expertise, then you do productive failure. If the learning goal is, standardized testing, certification, where it doesn't matter whether people are learning that deeply at all, or it's skills that you don't need to really understand, you just need to be able to do, then you don't need productive failure. So I think the point here is you don't have to do productive failure for everything. Just like in the math course, we did not do productive failure day in, day out. We said, just give 5. It was a random number, 5. Maybe it could have been 3 or 4, but the idea is pick the stuff that you want people to really know, understand, and be able to transfer. And for those core ideas of knowledge and skills, you design productive failure. For the rest of it, you don't have to do that. Okay? Because productive failure, the main effects are not on those basic knowledge and skills. The main effects are on understanding and transfer. So turn it around and say, what are the things that I want people to really understand and transfer? That's your productive failure target. The rest is not.
Okay. What about bringing productive failure? We know productive failure is more towards teaching, learning, but what about if we bring it in our daily lives? Can it be brought instead of training managers the skills they need to learn, maybe in how to speak with employees, coach them, and directly converse? So yeah, what are your reflections and experiences, if you might have, of how can we bring productive failure to the workplace?
There is now a lot of work that's happening I consult with, companies and organizations to change their, basically failure cultures, innovation cultures. And we use productive failure as a design framework to make that change. And how people, when they join a company, what does their onboarding look like? What does their training look like? One of the worst things that we do with new employees when they join us is to tell them how we do things. It seems intuitive that that's what you do, but it's very counterproductive. And that's like direct instruction. You join me and I say, oh, this is how we do things. And that's direct instruction. I'm telling you exactly how it is here and what we do. Whereas if you really want an innovation-driven culture, then you want to design a safe space for employees, not just for the new ones, but also for the current ones, where they can, explore problems or challenges that the companies is facing in ways that are more consistent with productive. And that's a design problem, and productive failure fits in quite nicely. So there's not a whole lot of research, because doing research in this environment is hard, but there is a lot of application of this framework into organizations and companies.
Are these applications available somewhere over the web?
No.
Or no. Okay.
No.
Okay, so I think there was a slide on 55% pass. So I'm now looking at the chat. So what happened to the 45%? Did they fail?
Yeah, they fail. They have to leave the university. That's the cutthroat thing. Like it's easy to enter, but hard to stay. Whereas in the US or in Singapore, it's hard to enter, but I think it's easier to stay. Right? So yeah, that's just the nature of the system here.
Oh.
But we raised it by 20%. So now, only 25% fail in the course, which raises another problem that now we have more students than we can handle. Yeah.
All right. So I think we have covered all the questions. So maybe if we could have you give us 3 takeaways for our audience. So I think we have training, we have solution providers, we have a wide variety.
Well, my 3 takeaways are the 3 parts that I delivered. One is know the problem that you're trying to solve. Just because it seems intuitive, just to, give direct instruction or tell exactly what it is in relation to your goals, make sure you understand the problem that we learn poorly, even from very good lectures. It gives you an illusion of learning, but the learning is shallow. So to the extent that that is okay with you, carry on, because direct instruction does optimize for basic knowledge. But wherever you want deep understanding, you've got to move, you've got to shift. Okay, that's one. I've talked about active learning and productive failure as 2 designs that are very robust. So think about how you may want to incorporate those designs into your learning environments and whatever solutions you provide, right? And third, in this post-pandemic era and the digitization, generative AI, and the need for flipped learning, I think hybrid learning is going to stay. But the point here is get the underlying pedagogical model sound. Don't focus so much on modality, get the model sound. And as I argued, we saw exactly, people have been talking about the positive effects of flipped learning and so many meta-analysis, but when you actually code what actually happens, we find that these effects are really coming from passive learning, both in online and classroom environments. And when you change that to active learning, even in regular classrooms, there is no benefit of the modality. It vanishes, right? So get the pedagogy right, get the sequence, the phases right. And then you can think about how do I implement this online or face-to-face. But don't jump on that bandwagon. Get the pedagogy right. That would be the third one, right?
Okay, that's great. That's great. So what should our next step be, Prof, after this session? Read papers, try and implement what's...
I think generally, I don't know how new this is to some of you, how you're familiar with it, but I think just take your time to read the papers, talk to people, discuss these ideas, because they are not entirely intuitive. The shift from direct instruction, just to get the idea that, oh, it can give you an illusion of understanding that remains shallow. I think that's just very hard for people to deal with. It just seems so intuitive that that's the case. So yeah, just discuss these ideas. If you have any questions, feel free to ask as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Prof. So thank you very much to our bold audience, both on screen and off screen. And we thank you very much to Professor for his deep thoughts. And yeah, I think flipped learning, productive failure, this is not just being unconventional, but it really makes us rethink our assumptions and how we've been doing teaching and learning all this while, especially in adult learning. So we at the Innovation Center are very grateful to each one of you, and we hope that you have enjoyed this session. Now, in the next couple of minutes, I will just showcase another interesting dialogue session that would be coming up on the 13th of July, which is on spatial AI. And it explores the AI technology that has context about its physical environment, location to enhance training, learning, and performance. So if time permits, do join us. And that's about it from us. Yeah, we have a 2-minute survey. Please do give us your valuable feedback.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for all your lovely messages as well. Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.